glad to see everyone aboard here. The way we talked about this session, we have an hour, so I'm going to use around 20 minutes or so, maybe 25, to just walk you through some of the major themes of the book. And then I hope you'll have questions and we can have a discussion about this. I'll look forward to that. So it's unfortunate, I'm used to Zoom right now, or I've been doing it enough that I know I hate it, because I'm used to being in a room and being high touch with people, and to me that's the essence of communication. But and I usually have some slides, so what I'm going to do is get to the essence of this book, what drove it and what the essential points are. And for those of you who have read it, because it's not out long, I hope you'll have some questions, or at least you'll hear some things that I will say that will provoke some questions. I figure the first thing I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about why I wrote this. And that's important to me. I grew up in Philly and made my way down to Atlanta to go to Morehouse College. And Morehouse was miraculous for me. I loved it. And Harvard, let's just say, was very different. At Morehouse, I was subject, and at Harvard, I reverted to my K-12 experience, which was predominantly white in suburban Philadelphia, and became object again. But the Morehouse experience was so powerful that it did not and could not affect me internally. I had armor on at that point. So the first thing I'm going to tell you about as a reason that drove me to this book was I came, and a lot of this is at that crossroads between Morehouse and Harvard. I developed a sensibility at Harvard about the gap between Morehouse and Harvard. There was a tremendous gap. I lost half of my classmates at Morehouse because they ran out of money. They were smart as all get out, but they just did not have the money. And here I am at Harvard for graduate school, and I saw nobody, not one human being, leave because of money. Money was not the issue. And to me, that was like, whoa. And then never mind the buildings and the great campus and the faculty who were teaching half the load that the Morehouse professors were teaching, less than half, many of them. And so it's a very different lifestyle. It's a very different way to do higher education. So I became very sensitive to that. But I didn't start at Harvard in the ed school. I started in the divinity school. And that's because I'm the son and grandson and great-grandson of preachers. And I grew up with this Christian construction of reality. And I wanted to know if all religions have the same thing in common, have anything in common. And I discovered that at Harvard Divinity School. And if were I presenting this in person, I would not tell you what that is. I would show you what that is, because I learned the lesson show, don't tell from my classmate and good friend at Morehouse, Spike Lee, who did a movie called Do the Right Thing. And in it, another Morehouse graduate, my era, Bill Nunn, there's this scene where he has two knuckles with love written across one knuckle, one hand, and hate written across the other. And he says, this is the story of life. It's a fight between love and hate. And, the way he sets it up, it's very dramatic, and it's a fight going on, and hate is beating up love, but then love comes back and finally puts hate down, and he ends it, Bill Nunn does, by saying, love is declared champion by KO, knocks out hate, and that's it. Well, it turns out that's what all religions have in common. No matter how dramatic, no matter how stressed we get, no matter how bleak it seems, that in the end, the story of humanity is going to be positive. It's going to end well. But what I also learned at Morehouse is you can't leave that to chance, and you cannot leave that to others. We have human agency. We have to do something about it. So the third driver that developed in me, that led to this book, basically while I was having the Morehouse and Harvard mindset in graduate school at Harvard, was a strategy, and it's born of that dichotomy between Morehouse and Harvard. I determined that Morehouse needs exactly what Harvard has, and Harvard needs exactly what Morehouse has. And Harvard, I determined, had capital, what I call in the book, capital optimization. They have optimized capital, all the wealth you could ever want in an educational setting. And so the setting is really perfect, but they don't touch character, in my view, in my experience, and compared to Morehouse. So Morehouse had optimized character and Harvard had optimized capital. And in my view, no educational institution has ever optimized both in the same setting at the same time. So to me, that's the holy grail. And that's what my book is essentially about. How do you optimize character and capital and produce better outcomes for this world? So that's what I wrote. I ended up calling it Hope and Healing, and I wanted a different title, but I lost that argument with Harvard Press, and I'll tell you about that later if we have time. The book is written in 5 perspectives in 10 chapters. The first perspective is a difficult birth of HBCUs. The second is humane aspiration. The third is the unfinished business of HBCUs, and that's the heart of the book. The fourth is a fluttering veil, and the fifth is a messianic promise. I'm not going to talk about all 5 of those perspectives. I'm going to talk about 3 things for you in the next 15 minutes, and we'll wrap. The 3 things are preceded by a perspective on American history that I have to tell you about that came as I was writing this book. So I'm going to share with you a perspective on American history. I'm going to talk about the HBCU endowment legacy, the HBCU democracy legacy, and then what I call the HBCU encore imperative. And all of these ideas are in the book, and so it's from the book. All right, so first, the perspective on history. I need you to know, if your education was anything like mine, we were miseducated. And I will tell you how I felt miseducated, because I had no idea coming through, especially K through 12, that human enslavement in America had as much to do with America's trajectory, becoming the #1 nation in the world as it did. And in the last 10, 15 years, all these books have been written, mostly by Ivy League scholars. And I'm talking about Eric Foner at Columbia, Walter Johnson at Harvard, the Davids, David Blight and David Davis at Yale, Ibram Kendi at BU, and a wild card in this is Craig Stephen Wilder at MIT, who wrote a book called Ebony and Ivy. But the most remarkable of them, those are all remarkable, especially Kendi, who I'm pretty close with. most remarkable of them is Cornell, Ed Baptist, who wrote a book called The Half Has Never Been Told. And to me, I was like, my jaw was dropped almost at every chapter, almost at every page. And he has this broad conclusion that enslaved African Americans built the modern United States, and indeed the entire modern world, in ways both obvious and hidden. This is a Cornell scholar who wrote that. One of the reasons why he says that is because of what David Davis of Yale concludes, and that is, and a number of others zero in on this, that by 1860, 80% of America's GNP was from the wealth generated by enslaved African Americans. And if you want a relative view in today's terms, that would be in Q1 of 2023, that would be over $21.3 trillion. That is substantial. I had no idea that human enslavement was that powerful, that prominent and dominant in the lives of Americans and in the economic life of America. And I have to go from that point to the way I spent most of my career. When I finished Harvard, I went to MIT and I started raising money. This was at the birth of the billion-dollar capital campaign era in higher education. 1985, I was in the room. We had this Ivy MIT Stanford group, and our colleagues from Stanford rushed in and said, we're going to do it, we're going to do it. And we said, what? So we're going to try to raise $1 billion in a 7-year period. And that was in 1985. Well, now Stanford and Harvard and others raise $1 billion per year, every year, from the private philanthropic community. And what I learned in 16 years of fundraising, frontline fundraising for MIT, is you go to where the money is. And when American higher education was born, the money was in the slave economy. And the wealthiest people in the country were the enslavers. And so I go from, you understand that American higher education, especially the Ivy League, was aided by privilege, aided by wealth, aided by that infrastructure that I was amazed by when I arrived as a student at Harvard in 1979. Much of it came up, much of it was born because of the wealth that came from human enslavement. The reason why Harvard and Yale, the other Ivies, are making all these name changes, all these adjustments, and all this reconciliation and coming to grips is because of that legacy. We now know Princeton, where my son attended, had a slave auction on campus outside of the president's house. Georgetown sold many enslaved Americans, and Yale, where my daughter went, had the names of slaveholders on the dorm in which she stayed and elsewhere. Contrast that with HBCUs, whereas white higher education, especially Ivies, were a glide downhill, aided by that wealth that came from enslavement. HBCUs had a difficult birth uphill, and I tell that story in the book. Fast forward, you get to 1928, and this rounds out the perspective on history. And you come to the first Black president of Howard University, and that is a Morehouse man named Mordecai Johnson. And Mordecai Johnson put out a mandate in 1928. He said Negroes must do a contradictory thing. They must insist that the doors of Harvard and Yale be kept open to Negroes, and at the same time, they must build up Howard and Lincoln as if there were no Harvard and Yale. And that framing right there dominated the last century. It was an attempt to break down the doors of the Harvards and Yales of the world, white higher education. So that when he said that 99% of African Americans in higher ed were in Black colleges, but by, let's say, 2022, 7% of African Americans in higher ed were in Black colleges, 93% now out of HBCUs. So his inclusion agenda, accessing white higher education, you can check that box. That has happened. But what I call the HBCU agenda, build up Howard and Lincoln on HBCUs in general, as if there were no Harvard and Yale, boy, that's a different story. And that's when I turn to the first of the 3 points that I want to make, and that is the endowment agenda. I'll make this quick by letting you know that when Ben Mays started his presidency of Morehouse, he lamented that if you put all the private HBCU endowments together, that combined, they would be less than a third, roughly a third of Harvard's endowment alone. Okay, he lamented that in 1946. Okay, we should fast forward to 2021. If you put all HBCU endowments together, not just the private ones as Mays did, but all HBCU endowments together, comes about $5.2 billion. Well, that's less than 1/10 of Harvard's $53.2 billion in 2021. So we've gone from the good old days of 1946, when we were a third of Harvard, to now being less than 1/10 of Harvard. To be a third of Harvard today would mean having roughly $18 billion. And HBCUs at 5.2. So what I learned and what I write about, that one of the biggest leaders and champions of endowment was not Ben Mays. He tried, but it was actually a man I grew up. Here's another way in which I was miseducated. I grew up despising, and I was taught to despise him and to favor Du Bois. And if your education was anything like mine, you had a shaded, jaded view of Booker T. Washington. And I did. I thought he was a compromiser. He was an accommodationist, et cetera, all the negative terms. And then I looked at him as a college president only, and this is what I write about in the book. He founded Tuskegee in 1881, and he went from no land to 34 years later, when he died in 1915, he had 5,000 Tuskegee-owned acres. So no land to 5,000 acres. He went from no buildings to 111 firm brick buildings, many of which stand today at Tuskegee. He went from no students to 1,537 students from 32 states and 19 foreign countries, and was at the time the biggest educational institution in the South, Black or white. He went from no faculty to 200 full-time faculty showing up at his funeral. And amazingly, he went from zero endowment to $2 million in endowment in 1915. And I said, oh my God. Okay, so one of the things I took the time to do when I was writing this book is I said, where were others by 1915 in endowment, and how fast did they get there? So I looked at the top 20 institutions, liberal arts institutions, as of 1915. I put 1915 as a marker in the book because in 2015 as a marker, 1915 to 2015 is a period, because when he died in 1915, just before he died, he said, I used to think that we would close the educational gap. And by that time, he was thinking mostly between Tuskegee and Harvard. He wanted to catch Harvard. We would close the educational gap in my lifetime. But now I think it's going to take about a century to do it. So that would be 2015. So I took a look at all these liberal arts colleges to see where they were in endowment by 2015. And I'm talking Amherst, Bates, Bowdoin, Carleton, Colby, Furman. Where were they by 1915 first? And all those colleges, Pomona, Mount Holyoke, Williams, they took on average 86 years to get to, from their founding, to get to $2 million in endowment. Tuskegee took 34 years, all right? Harvard took 233 years to get to $2 million in endowment. So I said, okay, Booker T. Washington was onto something. He mastered the art of fundraising. And I know the first, because you were miseducated like me, perhaps, the first thing you think is, well, yeah, he was able to raise money because he was bowing and scraping to white people. No, he was not. I read his speeches, and what he was saying to the African-American community in the South was very different from what he was saying to, and what he was saying to Southern whites, racist whites who wanted to kill him. It was very different from what he was saying to the wealthy whites in the North. And this was when the industrial wealth was just emerging. He had two of his biggest donors were Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and they are two of the wealthiest people in American history of all time. I've had the back page of the Chronicle 3 times, and on the first time I got it, I wrote about a speech that Booker T. Washington did in Madison Square Garden. This is in 2012. I wrote this. It's called "Wealthy Americans Meet Historically Black Colleges Again," Chronicle of Higher Ed, November 2012. And he basically said in that talk in 1903 what he had been telling the white wealthy community, and that is, unless you educate us, this country is going to fail miserably. And when he finished that speech, Andrew Carnegie wrote a check to him for $600,000 in 1903, and that's the equivalent of a $600 million gift, $608 million to be exact, in 2023 dollars relative to GDP, and that's more than what Mackenzie Scott just did. This man was masterful at endowment. And by the way, all those colleges he beat to $2 million in endowment by 1915. Vassar, Amherst, Williams, they now average $1.3 billion in endowment, and Tuskegee has $120 million. I talk about how that happened in the book. The endowment, the master of endowment at the time, black or white, was Booker T. Washington. That's why Charles Eliot, the iconic president of Harvard, honored him, gave him an honorary degree, visited Tuskegee on the 25th anniversary, and said, "You've done more in 25 years than Harvard has done in 250 years." And he was not wrong. Let me now turn to the what I call the democracy legacy of HBCUs. I do something that I never expected I would do in this book, and that is I compare HBCUs to Negro League baseball. And I said, if HBCUs are not careful, what will happen to them in this century will be an echo of what happened in Negro League baseball in the last century. Very quickly, the story of Negro League baseball is fascinating. I grew up hearing stories about this because my mom and her 4 siblings grew up in Philadelphia, about 3 or 4 blocks away from Tacony Field, which is where the Philadelphia Stars play. They saw on a regular basis Satchel Paige and all these people. My mom's 95 now. And my grandfather, her father, who was a preacher, preached the shortest sermons in history when there were games on Sunday. He got his sermons down to about an hour, when normally they were about 3 hours. Because he was at the game too, because this was a phenomenon. This was a big business. Negro League Baseball was it. It was the form of entertainment. And here's the fascinating thing: the game was different. You know that the NFL today is 65% African Americans. The NBA is 75% African Americans. But what has happened in the NFL and the NBA could have happened in Major League Baseball. But to be frank with you, to be crass, it scared the hell out of people. It scared the hell out of the whites running Major League Baseball. What was going on in Negro League Baseball? And they prevented and controlled integration like nothing else. The fact of the matter is there were these games. We call them exhibition games. Today, they were called barnstorming games back then. And the Negro League teams would play the teams from Major League Baseball, Babe Ruth, Lefty Grove, all the stars. They would play against the Negro League team. And Major League Baseball just put out the stats recently in the last year or so. They gather all the data, and the Negro League teams won the barnstorming games 75% of the time. This was a different form of baseball. My parents, my mom and her side of the family, they were seeing this. And I asked my mom and my uncle, her younger brother, 93 years old, I asked him a few weeks ago, I said, why were you so fascinated with this? And they said, it was phenomenal. And I said, yeah, but you saw, I grew up watching Major League Baseball. What's the difference? And they said, my mom put it this way. She said, well, you'd have to see it to believe it. But when we played with soul. All right. And this is why Major League Baseball, and there are documentaries now that talk about this. When they integrated by individual. There's a guy named Rube Foster in the Negro League. He had played in the Negro League, then ran a team, then ran the league. He was insisting in the 1930s and 40s that when we integrate by team. He wanted the American League of Major League Baseball to accept one team and the National League to accept one team. But that's what scared the organizers, the managers of Major League Baseball to death, because they feared that the playoffs and the World Series would every year feature the Negro League teams. And they said, oh, hell no. And so they, in 1947, took Jackie Robinson, and they took one black ball player kind of at a time. At its peak, African Americans were 28% of Major League Baseball, but they're now 6% of Major League Baseball. And the net result of that, and I talk about this in the book, is because of the mindset. Major League Baseball took the players, but they did not take the game. All right? When you take the players and you don't take the game, you lose something essential. Earlier, I told you that 93% of African Americans are now being educated outside of HBCUs. So American higher education has gotten a lot of the players. But the HBCU game was not imported. And the HBCU game is what I call the unheralded value of HBCUs. That's a whole chapter. Is the deliberate effort that HBCUs did basically in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to aggressively and deliberately educate the generals and foot soldiers of a civil rights movement to improve American democracy. All right? I ask in this book, why didn't the civil rights movement happen 100 years before it did? Maybe on the heels of Reconstruction when that went down, as led by the graduates and students of the Ivy League who would have been trained by the faculty and leaders of Ivy League institutions and others. Why didn't that happen? Well, because white higher education has never really been about democracy enhancement in the way that HBCUs were. That was the HBCU game. That's why we got Martin Luther King and Thurgood Marshall. And I have, when I present, I have multiple slides of the iconic generals and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement who were educated by HBCUs, almost invariably, certainly early on. And I say that's the HBCU games, but you got the players, but not the game. And that's why I wrap to a close. The HBCU Encore imperative is we need to do that again. But when I say we need to do that again, I don't mean HBCUs. I mean all of American higher education must use an HBCU approach to shaping better citizens. I conclude in this book that a broken democracy cannot heal a broken planet. That's our peril right now. To have any hope of healing both today's higher education and philanthropic communities must play a consequential role. And my prescription, and I use the final chapter of the book to outline this, is we need to aggressively, deliberately, and as an emergency, create three kinds of people. The first kind of person we need to create comes from Du Bois. I call those destination citizens. It's a longer story on each. And when I visit campuses, I talk about this because I'm being asked, what does this mean? Can you help us to do this? Destination citizens, in a nutshell, are this. It comes from this, what happened to Du Bois. He was 72 years old and he realized, he said, I made a mistake. He said, I've been living all my life making too many assumptions about the direction of the world and the people controlling it, maneuvering it. He said, I made a mistake. He said, it was as though moving on a rushing express, my main thought was as to my relations with the other passengers on that express and not to its rate of speed or its destination. He had a seat mindset. What seat am I going to sit in on this train called America? That's the equivalent of asking, what neighborhood am I going to live in? What kind of car am I going to drive? Where are my kids going to go to school? Where's my vacation going to? What are my material appointments and anointments? What's my capital side of things? He said, I should have been more concerned about not my seat on the train, but where the train is going and at what rate of speed. And that's a destination mindset. My concern is that we're educating people in this country as competitors for seats, caring little or nothing about the destination. And that's why the democracy's in trouble and the planet's in trouble. We need to educate more aggressively and deliberately with a destination mindset. The second type of person is what I call a second day citizen. It comes from Mark Twain, who says the two most important days in your life are the day you're born and the day you find out why. And 8 billion people have had their first day, but I insist that a small minority of us have had our second day, are living life on purpose, are living a purpose-driven life, and living and carrying themselves as if they are doing what they were born to do. That's a rare thing. I know people like that, and I could talk about them. Now, I should pause and honor my ancestors, honor my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather, who would say to me, young man, you attribute that concept to Mark Twain, second-day citizens, but what in God's name do you think we meant when we stood in the pulpit and talked about being born again? That's your second day, boy. So give to us, not Twain. All right, so I give them that nod. Twain is a little crisper, and I don't have to get theological. The third type, and I end with this. I'm leaving 20 minutes. I meant to leave 30. I apologize. I sometimes get carried away. Sorry. The third type is a string shooter. And this comes from what I call the most brilliant man alive, and that's Ikwe Armah. He was educated at Harvard, by the way, from Ghana, grew up as a prince. They were astounded by his brilliance. And the colonialists, this is in the 1960s, the colonialists recognized it, and they sent him to Achimota, which was the colonial school there. He blew them away. They sent him to Groton in America. He blew them away. And he went to Harvard and finished it in 3 years. The guy he has a mind like nobody else, right? And no other human being, I swear to God, if you meet him, he's still alive. He's in Senegal. I visited him 4 or 5 times, including a few months ago. I'll be going to see him again in a few months. Ikwe Armah, he's written multiple books. One of them is called The Healers. This book changed my life. I handed this book in particular, that and The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, to my freshmen as each year when I presided at Harvard. But The Healers has in it a sub-story, and I'll tell you it briefly, and I'll end with this, about Denzu. He's writing about the time when Africa is trying to fight off colonialism, and these African communities were trying to resist, and they were trying to hold on to their values. And one of the things they had done was they had what we would call Olympic Games. They had these competitions that lasted for about a week, and all kinds of mental games and physical games. And it came down to 3 people at the end of this week. And it came down to the last competition. And the protagonist in the story is named Denzu. And the contest was marksmanship. They had to take a rifle. The judges tied a bird to a string, like a kite string, sent it flying in the air, and only when the judge said, okay, when the bird was high enough, could you shoot. And the one who brought it down in the fewest shots would be crowned champion and would win the games. And so Denzu was one of the main resistors of the Western influence on their values. And he resisted how these games had gone from being cooperative to really competitive and down to a single celebrated champion instead of a community celebration at the end. And he was the 3rd person to shoot. The first person took the bird down, took 3 shots to shoot it, to kill the bird. And on the 3rd shot, blew it out of the sky. Blood and guts come to the ground. The second person shoots and in 2 fires. Then it's Denzu's turn. And the bird goes up in the air and the judge tells him, okay, you can fire. And Denzu waits and the bird goes higher and higher. And everybody's wondering, what are you doing? And the bird goes almost out of sight. And Denzu, with a smile on his face, shoots. And the bird falters a bit and then soars and takes off. And the judge goes, what did you do? And Denzu said, you saw what I did. I missed the bird. And the judge says, you missed on purpose. You shoot the string, not the bird. And Denzu says, I lost. And he walks away. And as his story is written, he walks to a new way of life. He wanted to send a signal that what we're doing, he had all the skills that everybody else had, but he chose a more difficult feat. He chose to shoot the string that freed the bird instead of shooting the bird. He planted a stake in the ground about a different set of values. So in my discussion about Harvard Press, when I finished, I said, I'm going to call this the string shooters. Black colleges and the future of American democracy as a subtitle. And at the time, there were all these shootings in America. And they said, John, we can't have shooters in the title. And I finally yielded after a few months. And I said, okay, hope and healing. But I promised, I said, I'm going to tell this story from now on, because the last chapter of the book is called String Shooters, the String Shooters, because to me, with all the skills we have now, we can, by educating destination citizens and second-day citizens and string shooters, we can condition people, even to this day in our colleges, to educate people who will do something fundamentally different than what the crowd is doing to be string shooters. I close with that. I've been too long, but I got excited when I wrote the book, and I get excited when I present. So I apologize for taking too much time, but let's go to the questions. Thank you.
Not too much time, John. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So yes, we've reached the Q&A and discussion portion of our session. So I welcome anyone who wants to ask a question out loud to raise your hand. We'll call on you, or you can put your questions into the chat.
Go ahead, Francesca, please. No, you please go.
All right. Well, John, hi, my name is Francesca Purcell. I have heard so much about you from a lot of folks. I'm fairly new to the ed school. I'm the faculty and I teach in the higher education program, and just really thrilled to listen to you today and so much of what you've done. So I guess what I want to ask you a little bit about, so at the beginning of your talk, you talked about sort of, how Harvard has maximized capital and HBCUs. Well, now I'm like going back to your, like the game, right? Like the game is happening at HBCUs. So like, can you talk more about like, how can places like Harvard do more of what is happening so well and for such a long time that has been baked into the history of HBCUs in a much more aggressive, assertive way that can even begin to approach anything like that?
Francesca, that's a great question. First things first, one of the things Harvard can do is start having a lot of conversations like this. When I was a student at Morehouse, the whole school convened to have conversations like this minimum twice a week. What's called, this was when chapel was mandatory. We got together in what was then Sale Hall, what is now King Chapel, twice a week. And we heard speakers from all over the country, and the culture of this convening was not on the how, but on the why. It was on the destination. It was on the second day. It was on being string shooters. You have to be different when you come out of here. That was intentional. And when I say that was the game, that game has faded, to be honest, to be candid, in HBCUs. So progress is recovery for HBCUs as well. It was this message, this ethic, this culture was far more powerful when I was a student at Morehouse than it was when I was president, and I was trying to bring it back as president. So Harvard has to intend to. Now I have to acknowledge that by far, in my view, the most consequential president of Harvard has been Drew Gilpin-Faust. Why? Because she was an architect and not a contractor. She decided to take on some of the toughest battles. She took on the funnel clubs. She decided to listen and to hear, beyond just listening, to hear. And she heard those African-American students in 2012 and 2013 saying, I too am Harvard. And she's like, what? By the way, without too much of a stretch, that's what we were saying as students in all 6 years when I was at Harvard. We were feeling invisible, and we were saying, hey, wait a minute, we're here. If you listen to us, this place can get better because we've come with a different perspective. We come with some game, by the way, and we can help Harvard if you just listen. Drew Faust listened to those students saying that, and she decided to launch a belonging initiative. And I ended my Morehouse presidency and came up to Harvard, minding my own business at the ed school as a president and resident. And she said, John, I want you to help me stand up this belonging initiative. And I spent 3 years at Harvard. My good friend, Larry Bacow, and Larry Bacow, I want to say, was a transformational president at Tufts. He wasn't at Harvard long to do everything he wanted to do. It was just 5 years, but I decided to work. I agreed to work with him. We stood that thing up and we did a survey. You all should check out the results of that survey. The academic council voted to do it every other year. Only the first one has happened. You take a look at the findings of the first one, you understand why that's important. But I believe that Claudine Gay is going to make good. She's going to keep that momentum, and we're going to have a good run on her watch as president. And one of the reasons is because she's going to prioritize that. I know that. So this is a pathway that Harvard has to be on. That's a long answer, but Francesca, I feel good about the foundation set by Drew Faust and Larry Bacow, and I believe that Claudine Gay is gonna do something special. And I'll come back and help if I get asked. I mean, as an advisor, not to work. I'm done. Other questions?
Yeah, Dr. Wilson, that was Francesca. That was my question, is what can schools like Harvard do? So I'm going to be a little bit selfishly personal and just say I haven't read your book. I've just purchased it during the talk. I'm going to look for you in the Philadelphia area where I work, but the serendipity. I've been in the midst of a fun research self-interested project around a guy named Ed Bolden, who was Rube Foster's sort of counter in the Philly area.
Wow.
And he's sort of unknown. He's clearly a Booker T. Washington devotee, but just a fascinating story. So I so appreciated your time.
Well, thank you. Where are you in Philly? Where do you work?
I work at a private day school, Episcopal Academy, up in Newtown Square, about 1,200 pre-K through 12 kids.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. My message is a little sophisticated for that. That level, but I take any opportunity I can to come back to Philly. I believe green, by the way. I'm an Eagles fan.
All right, thank you. I have to hop off.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Good to see you, Chris.
John, we had a question that came into the alumni community submitted by Karen, who is on this call. Karen asked, how will the latest Supreme Court ruling on college admissions impact HBCUs and others?
Well, there are two schools of thought on that. One is these policies we're talking about at the more selective schools were really making a fringe kind of difference. They were not influencing most of the schools, most of higher education. These policies never influenced. Okay. So in that sense, it's going to be a modest impact. The impact is more general, by the way, in terms of the mood of the country and the direction of progress for the country. But there's expected to be some kind of return to HBCUs by the higher performing African Americans. The ones who've gotten these competitive grades and scores that can get them into many of those places. But HBCUs are going to have to do a lot more to attract them and to give them the kind of experience they would have expected by going Ivy. I have 3 children. All 3 went Ivy. I begged my daughters to go to Spelman. I was on the board at Spelman at the time. But their cousin was at Spelman, and they're like, Dad, she's trying to figure out what she's doing this summer. If I go to Yale, I can go to an office, sign up, and go to Dubai for the summer and do research. Well, that's that wealth difference I saw when I went from Morehouse. I was like, they were looking at all those things. And even Wellesley, I said, you know, she looked at Wellesley. She noticed that Spelman spends $80 million a year to educate 1,600 students, and Wellesley spends $180 million a year to educate 1,600 students. So what's that $100 million difference? I had done that analysis. It was sitting on my desk, and she spotted that. She said, "Dad, what are you doing?" I said, "Stay away from my desk." Look, I tried to get them to make a different decisions. I want our HBCUs to be more magnetic, and I think that's going to have to happen. There are some that are getting there. Howard and Spelman in particular have really taken a leap forward, but I could give you a long answer. There will be an impact. It may not be what everybody thinks.
Right. And then, John, another question came in from Francis. Francis writes, "Great conversation. I cannot wait to read the book. As someone who works with high school students considering HBCUs and American schools, I'm wondering how you talk to young people about this option. It sounds like your kids went to Princeton and Yale. You were just talking about that. She asked, did they go against your recommendation? And do you think these American colleges are working in the HBCU framework?"
Yeah, my daughters attended Harvard and Yale, and the one who went to Yale hated it and transferred to Stanford and thrived. That's where her mom went. My son, I've raised the boy all of his life to go to Morehouse. And in the middle of his senior year in high school, I became president of Morehouse. And he said, "Dad, deuces, I'm out. I cannot." He's John Sylvanus Wilson III. And he said, "Dad, this is not going to work." He made the best decision of his life, because that would have been too much. They got what they needed at those places because Carol and their parents gave them what they needed. Sometimes you come with stuff. And so they are forces for good. I'm convinced of that. But I worry about a whole lot of others. One of the things in my book is I point to Alexander Meiklejohn. He was this iconic president of Amherst. This guy was ahead of his time. He was ahead of his time. He, back in the 19 teens and 20s, he basically framed what I framed in the book. And he challenged Amherst. He basically said, "Okay, people, what's it going to be? What are we going to be about? Aristocracy or democracy?" I could not have said better. That's why I quoted him on that in the book. And basically, within 2 years of him challenging the campus and the board, he was put out of the presidency. It's called the Meiklejohn affair. It's a controversy because he was daring to question. Well, the guy starts hanging out with John Dewey and starts hanging out with, and later with James Baldwin. The guy was just ahead of his time, had a different set of values. We need more people like that. We need leaders like that who will think outside of the contractor box and think as architects. And that's a contrast I make in the book between contractors and architects, and do what we need to save the country and the world. I know that's a big order. I know that's big language. It's ambitious, but that's what I learned at Morehouse. You have to dare to believe that you can do big things, and that's the only way you can do them. Benjamin Elijah Mays personally mentored and conditioned Martin Luther King to change the world. Martin Luther King was a deliberate creation of the things that were going on that campus. A deliberate creation, and so many others were as well. That was not magic pixie dust. That can happen again. You just have to lean in a little more and care and lean into people's lives and not teach subjects, but teach people, get to know names and get into the lives of people. That's how it happens. That's how it happened for me. I had my second day at Morehouse College. And so did that guy I mentioned in the beginning, Spike Lee. He had his second day on the campus at Morehouse College. I know I'm name dropping, but these are my classmates, doggone it. And Samuel L. Jackson, the highest grossing actor of all time, second day at Morehouse, learned to act then. And Jay Johnson, former Homeland Security Secretary, second day at Morehouse College. We're all in the same class, same era. Sam Jackson got kicked out and then had to come back and finish because he locked up the Board of Trustees. So there were problems at Morehouse worthy of locking up the board. So, but I see it's 1 o'clock and I respect the time. I always do. Any closing questions, Lisa? We had time.
Well, it's not a question, but one of our faculty, Joe Blatt's on the call and just wrote a comment, basically saying that you're willing to resume advising at Harvard, and hopefully you want to follow through on that because they'll probably be calling on you.
Well, we'll see what happens. I spoke at a conference on character at the Ed School a few months back, late in the spring. And there was some buzz. So I think I might be invited back. You should see my slides. Gates Foundation gave me a big grant and I put together these slides. So I got a nice presentation. I look forward to giving it at Harvard. But thank you all for signing on. I really appreciate you for taking the time. Busy day. It's an hour. I'm going to end by giving a shout out. Thank you to Lisa. Thank you for setting this up. Thank you all for signing on. But a shout out to Tyrone Latin, a guy I've been in touch with since I was at MIT and kind of mentored him a bit, brought him into the field of fundraising. And so I'm glad and he has my book right there, holding it up. Good man, Tyrone. You were a good man when I first met you. You're still a good man. And all of you are just great for signing on. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And all of you will receive a follow-up email with the recording with some other details related to the session next week. But John, this was amazing. Thank you very, very much.
All right. Thank you all. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.